Good afternoon. It's Thursday, the 5th of January 2017. Welcome to UK Column News, just after 1 o'clock. And I'm joined today by Vanessa Beeley. Apologise for the incorrect lower third there. Brian is not, in fact, with us, although the lower third said he is, and hopefully he will be back tomorrow. But Vanessa, welcome to the programme. How are things? I take it you're back from Syria now?
Yeah, I got back actually on pretty much New Year's Eve. So I've only been back a few days.
And tell us, how was it over Christmas in Syria then?
It was an extraordinary mix. I mean, I was very fortunate to be in Aleppo actually just before Christmas, during the actual liberation, and then at Christmas after the full liberation and evacuation. So it was wonderful to be involved in the very real celebrations by people of both East and West Aleppo. The people of East Aleppo to be liberated, and the people of West Aleppo to, one, be reunified with their families in East Aleppo, but also to be free from the almost daily deluge of mortars and sniper fire, suicide bombers, explosive bullets that they'd endured for the last almost 5 years.
Okay, well, look, I think what we're going to do then is we'll talk about what's going on in Syria now, shortly. But before we do that, I want to have a look again at the mainstream media coverage in recent weeks, in the last couple of months, and also at a couple of the people that the mainstream media is relying upon for their information about Aleppo. Because, I mean, you have been receiving some pretty horrendous attacks recently, accusations that you weren't actually in Aleppo, for example. But let's just have a look at some of the people that the mainstream are relying upon for the information. And we'll start off with Waad Al-Khatib. She is an award-winning filmmaker, apparently, and Channel 4 News have used her exclusively in their InsideAleppo.com series. Give us a bit of background.
Well, Waad Al-Khatib is actually the wife of so-called Dr. Hamza Al-Khatib, who we'll talk about very, very shortly as well. And in fact, in the last few days prior to the full liberation of East Aleppo, Jon Snow was tweeting that Channel 4 were very concerned about their camera woman. And I think this was the first time that it was actually admitted that she was, to some extent, exclusively Channel 4's project inside East Aleppo, which is very interesting. At the same time, she was being endorsed by Channel 4 as being a recipient of 2 Amnesty International Media Awards for her camera work inside East Aleppo.
So we've got The Guardian promoting her, we've got she's mainly working for Channel 4, and we've got one of the major NGOs giving awards to this lady.
Absolutely. And of course, if we go back to the Libya war, or let's say the reduction of Libya to a failed state by the NATO no-fly zone, and if we look at Amnesty International's role in facilitating that no-fly zone at the time, and how later much of what they had been propagating as the narrative against Gaddafi and against Libya effectively was proven to be fake. Now, yet again, we're seeing Amnesty International supporting and awarding a camera woman who we will see very shortly can only be described as connected to, if not fully supporting, Nusra Front, Al-Qaeda inside Syria.
So this is her husband, is that correct?
Yes, this is her husband. I keep saying so-called Dr. Hamza Al-Khatib, and I have suggested to Channel 4 that they check with Aleppo University whether this doctor, as he calls himself, ever actually qualified from Aleppo University.
And just give us his full name again.
His full name, or his full stage name, let's say, is Dr. Hamza Al-Khatib.
Okay, and it's not just Channel 4 News is promoting Dr. Hamza, because here he is on Newsnight as well.
Hmm. Yes.
And is this the elusive last doctor in Eastern Aleppo?
I mean, he was regularly described as the last doctor in East Aleppo, particularly in his petition to President Obama.
Right, so here we go. His petition on change.org, and he describes himself as being, well, he says he's one of the very last doctors. But the mainstream media absolutely pushing him being the last doctor, and no matter how many others left or were alleged to have been killed or injured,
Well, and also, not forgetting the 4,160 doctors in West Aleppo that were completely disappeared by this mainstream media, who insisted upon their last pediatrician, their last doctor, their last clown, their last gardener, and running out of all the various lasts that they produced in their propaganda. But what basically they were doing was completely disappearing the 1.5 million Syrian civilians in West Aleppo and the 4,160 doctors in West Aleppo.
Indeed. Now, this shot here is from a video, which I think is a demonstration taking place in Idlib. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah. In fact, this goes to show one thing very clearly, that Hamza al-Khatib left on the buses with the Nusra Front-led terrorist and militant factions who were the last to be deported or evacuated from the East Aleppo districts. So he did not stay, in other words, with the civilians that he claimed to have been treating and rescuing for the last 4+ years. He left with the Nusra Front delegation, let's say, that had been imprisoning, starving, executing, torturing, and depriving those civilians that he claimed to be treating of humanitarian aid, food, any sort of medical assistance for the last 4.5 years. And that statement is based upon the testimony of those Syrian civilians that were allowed to escape from the East Aleppo districts.
Okay, well, here's an image of him. He's on the right-hand side there, and he seems to have his arms around a gentleman with a beard and a scarf. Who is that person that he's quite close to
I
there?
mean, this is very interesting. If we bear in mind what we've just mentioned, that Hamza al-Khatib was really the poster boy for the mainstream media, corporate media narrative against Syria. He was used in his letter to Obama to be calling for a no-fly zone, which, again, we know that this would have been a repeat of what happened in Libya, one, but would also potentially have engendered a war between the United States coalition and Russia on Syrian soil, and certainly exacerbated the bloodshed for the Syrian people and their suffering. Now, this guy on the left, and he's clearly tagged in this photograph, so there's no doubt over his identity. This is Al-Mayaf. Al-Mayaf is basically the second in command of Nour al-Din Zinki, who is the terrorist group, although it's being funded by the United States. The United States has never admitted that the crime they committed, the public beheading of a 12-year-old Palestinian child, Abdullah Isa, was a crime against humanity. They've never accepted that. And as far as I am aware, they have continued to fund this group while refusing to designate it a terrorist group. However, its actions in publicly beheading a 12-year-old child, while previous to the beheading they'd been humiliating and torturing him, is an act of terrorism. And here we see Channel 4, BBC, CNN poster boy Hamza al-Khatib hugging not only a member of Nour al-Din Zinki, the second in command, and actually present at the execution of Abdullah Isa.
We've got to ask, I mean, we'll ask this question again in a moment, Vanessa, but we've got to ask, where does this leave mainstream reporting?
Well, I mean, it should leave it in the gutter where it belongs. I mean, this is extraordinary. You know, while Alex Thompson is saying to me on Twitter that I shouldn't be using the term terrorist because it's an abusive term and it designates cheerleading, here we have a clear example that for the last 4.5 years, Channel 4 has effectively been cheerleading for terrorism. And you know, they and the BBC, in fact, all corporate media, as I have said, have spent the last 5 years claiming to be protecting the civilians inside East Aleppo. Whereas now, what is being exposed and revealed, which is what all of us have suspected for the last 5 years, is that in reality, they've been protecting the terrorist and militant groups led by Nusra Front. Again, this information is not something I'm creating out of thin air. This is coming from the testimony of the Syrian civilians leaving East Aleppo, that the predominant group was Nusra Front, which is Al-Qaeda in Syria, that the majority of the other 22 estimated brigades of militant and terrorist factions, including Aral, Sham, and Nour al-Din were under the control of Nusra Front, which is Al-Qaeda. And if we look at those activists and those groups that have been used by the corporate media, including Channel 4, to basically promote their narrative, which of course is in line with the UK regime change agenda inside Syria. The majority of them are running with Nusra Front. They're affiliated to and allied to extremist factions inside East Aleppo that have been torturing, executing, starving the people that this corporate media has been claiming to be protecting. It's one of the most criminally hypocritical deceptions and propaganda projects that I think we've ever witnessed. And the fact that this has gone on for almost 5 years and has ensured the wholesale suffering of those civilians, both in East Aleppo and in West Aleppo, I mean, I'm actually pretty speechless over it.
Well, just before we show one final image on this, I just want to clarify, of course, the Alex Thompson you're talking about is not the same Alex Thompson that was on with us on the UK Column News yesterday.
No, apologies to Alex Thompson that was on yesterday. This is Alex Thompson of Channel 4.
Yes. Okay. And just finally, we've got the same doctor then with more Al-Qaeda, Al-Nusra people, and this time looks like he's looking at a map. What could they possibly be doing there?
Well, this was actually taken from, I think this was taken from a Nusra Front propaganda page. And this was actually probably about a few months before the liberation of East Aleppo. And again, I posed the question to Channel 4, I never received an answer, is why they were using as their poster boy Hamza al-Khatib, where here he's seen with two terrorist factions poring over maps of the battleground in Al Ramusa. And of course, again, this was just before Channel 4 released the video, which they then took down, where they basically showcased Nour al-Din calling them rebels and normalizing their suicide bombing attacks against the Syrian Arab Army and against the Syrian people in West Aleppo. So, you know, this extraordinary litany of terrorist propaganda that Channel 4 has been producing and running with without verifying and without doing the background checks on the activists or the doctors or the citizen journalists that they've been using to basically produce the news for them from East Aleppo, while, as I said, effectively disappearing 1.5 million people in West Aleppo.
Okay, so we're going to we're going to show a quick video in a second. Jon Snow interviewing. Just tell us who he was interviewing.
Ah, yes, this was the Jon Snow interview with Faresh Shahabi. Faresh Shahabi is an Aleppo MP, an independent MP, so he's not affiliated to the Syrian government Ba'ath Party. He runs as an independent MP, but he's also the head of the Chamber of Commerce in Aleppo.
Okay, so what I've done here is, because I just wanted to sort of highlight the type of questioning that Jon Snow is offering here. So we've just cut out the questions themselves just to make this point, and so we'll watch the questions and then we'll have a comment about it just quickly afterwards.
Before we came on air, I spoke to Faraz Shahabi, a pro-regime MP for Aleppo. Testimony of the civilians that we went to is that they were bombed from the air by barrel bombs dropped by aircraft belonging to the Syrian and Russian air forces. But all afternoon there were artillery shells coming in, and they were coming in from the Syrian army. But the people who are dying are not terrorists, they are civilians. You can see them, you speak to them. These are children, they are young people, and they're very old people, and they are not terrorists. The civilian population there is perfectly clear. They do not wish to live under Mr. Assad. They do not wish to live under your regime. They wish to be free. Mr. Shahabi, I'm sorry, but there is no government on earth at this moment that has killed as many of its own people as yours has. Your own constituents, your own friends, you claim, they have been killed by the government, flying planes, dropping barrel bombs. You are the MP for Aleppo. Your own constituents are dying from your own air force, and you don't do anything about it. You don't seem to care a damn about your own constituents. If that is the case, Mr. Shahabi, why do you bomb the hospitals in which your own constituents, your own civilians are seeking aid to help them repair the wounds that your air force has inflicted? And then what do you say to the 45 civilians today killed in East Aleppo, killed by barrel bombs and artillery?
Look, if you are going to legitimize and beautify the existence of terrorist activity inside my city, you will not get any approval from me or from any citizen in Aleppo.
I had to give Mr. Shahabi the last word there, because that interview style was, Vanessa, just so obtuse. I can't even describe it. It's so aggressive.
Obscene, I think, is I mean, we saw this previously when Cathy Newman interviewed Dr. Shaban, and bearing in mind that the interview of Dr. Shaban was on the day that the US coalition, including Britain, including Australia, including Denmark, had bombed for 1 hour Syrian Arab army soldiers defending Deir ez-Zor against ISIS, and that bombing allowed ISIS to advance into Deir ez-Zor. And to watch Cathy Newman's Goebbels-esque interrogation of Dr. Shaban on that day, when in reality they should have been apologizing for their regime's mass murder of the Syrian National Army. And here again, we have Jon Snow along the same Goebbels-esque lines, absolutely in interrogating an MP in Aleppo, an independent MP, who has effectively been working to stem the flow of terrorism that has been poured into his country by the very regime that Channel 4 is defending and basically working in lockstep with. And it can't be any clearer than from this interview. I was also told by Faraz Shahabi that much of what he actually said was edited, deliberately edited.
Well, actually, Vanessa, I do recommend that everybody goes and finds that, tracks that interview down and watches the full interview, because it's absolutely clear as you watch that interview that it's been heavily edited. And that, where is the balance here, and where's Ofcom for that matter?
Exactly. As you quite rightly pointed out, Ofcom has been employed to demonize and vilify RT. And yet here we have Channel 4 displaying one of the most appalling, partisan and biased pieces of, I can't even bring myself to call it journalism without choking on the word, because it's so far removed from journalism. It's a joke. It's a satire of journalism. In fact, Channel 4 should be possibly celebrating the fact that they've now moved from any semblance of serious journalism into pure satire.
Absolutely. A couple of people in the chat box just asking for details of that. Jon Snow was the interviewer, but we'll put the link to the interview underneath the video once it goes up on the Column website on YouTube and so on. Yeah, again, for the sake of balance, we have an interview here that you did with Faraz Shahabi. So we're just going to show that's just very, very quick, 45 seconds. We'll show this and then you can comment on it afterwards.
Yeah.
This place, when this area was under the Nusra and ISIS occupation and the Free Syrian Army was here, this place here, this factory, was ISIS propaganda center and command center. ISIS leaders used to be in this place, the olive oil factory. So what I did is, once this area liberated, this factory was liberated, I turned it into a school to provide free secular education for 1,500 students. This is the best way to combat terrorism and jihadi ideology, is to provide secular education for these kids who were deprived of any education for more than 2 years. This opened since June 2014.
It's nice to hear the sound of children in the background, Vanessa.
Yeah, I mean, this was in the Sheikh Najjar industrial area, and Faraz took us to this building, which was now it's a disused olive oil factory, because as he quite rightly said, he's converted it into a school for 1,500 children, run by actually state salaried, so Syrian state salaried teachers. Now, the interesting thing was the Sheikh Najjar area was taken over, as he said, actually by ISIS very early on in 2012, and it was liberated in around 2014. So it was under occupation for those 2 years. And during those 2 years, those children in that area received no education. Now, this was a common theme. When I went into Hanano, another one of the eastern Aleppo districts that was liberated, we went in literally about 48 hours after liberation. We spoke to Hamid Al-Omar, who was the director of one of the schools in Hanano. And what he actually said also was for 5 years, almost 5 years, because that liberation had taken longer, the children were living under a regime, as he called it, of enforced ignorance. And even children that we spoke to said that they had had no education for the last 5 years, other than via what we can assume to be extremist sheikhs or imams, affiliated to the various extremist groups that were ruling these areas for the period of time of their occupation, whether it was 2 years in Sheikh Najjar or whether it was 5 years almost in East Aleppo. So I think, going back to the Jon Snow interview, what was extraordinary was this accusation that Faraz Shahabi, who has demonstrated actually nothing but defending the interests of his people in Aleppo, was being accused indirectly of effectively attacking those very people that he has been defending since the dirty war against Syria was started. And, Jon Snow also mentions the killing of the 45 civilians. He mentions the bombing of hospitals. The civilians, when we spoke to all of them, all that we spoke to, and we asked them, were the Syrian Arab Army firing upon civilians trying to leave? They laughed. They said, no. The terrorists were shooting at us. The terrorists were the ones trying to prevent us leaving. So again, we're seeing not only shameless propaganda, but shameless defense of the terrorist actions, and trying to conceal the guilt of these terrorist factions that Channel 4 has been defending and cheerleading for the last 5 years, defending their actions, murdering civilians, trying to escape their imprisonment. I mean, this just can't get any more twisted and perverted than how Channel 4 are dealing with reporting on the situation in Aleppo.
Well, we think it can't get any worse, and then it does. We'll just close this little section off with this one, because this is the BBC, once again, The Real Housewives of ISIS, which they think is comedy. And the quote that the Daily Mail here pulls from it for their headline is, "It's only 3 days to the beheading and I've got no idea what to wear." And the reaction has been interesting to watch the reaction from the public to this. There are two very distinct groupings, I think, Vanessa. One is the grouping which says, oh, it's fine, it's just a bit of comedy, it's actually very funny and all this kind of stuff. That's what they say. And on the other hand, there are the people that are quite rightly absolutely outraged by this, because what we're talking about here is terrorism and deaths and beheadings of children.
I mean, I spoke to you quickly just before the show, and I don't know what astounds me more. I guess I'm not astounded that the BBC should try to deflect any accusations against the BBC of its supporting extremism in Syria. So I guess, from the BBC, it's about as low as we would expect of them. But I guess what astounds me the most is that the BBC's been caught out with its moral pants down regarding Syria. It's been proven to be lying. It's been proven to be supporting terrorism. And yet people in the UK in particular seem to be so ready to move on and to basically defend this appalling, abhorrent attempt at satire by a bunch of UK regime shills that are the BBC, that are now making light of the situation that they helped to create in Syria, and also without any respect for or consideration of the opinion of the Syrian people, who do not find this amusing. So in other words, this sort of politically correct, lame, liberal attitude of some of the British public, defending it as freedom of speech, but with no consideration, no respect, no empathy for the suffering of the Syrian people that has been exacerbated by this excuse for a media outlet that is nothing more than a regime shell, advertising terrorism, promoting extremism, exacerbating the suffering of those Syrian people. I'm actually really disgusted that people should even consider it acceptable, and that they should not be turning this freedom of speech claim against the BBC. Why are they not saying, okay, if you want to produce satire about all of those crimes that you have defended and that you have promoted for the last 5 years? But they're not doing this. They're just limply accepting this as being funny and as being an attack on ISIS via comedy. It isn't.
It's interesting just to note, to close this off, that both the BBC and Channel 4, of course, are both so-called public service broadcasters. What does that mean? Government propagandists? Is that the correct definition?
Well, it seems to be that way. And again, are the public happy that they're paying 3.7 billion in license fees for this organization to produce this kind of dross? Come on, where are our standards? I mean, please.
Yes. Okay. Well, look, let's move on, and let's go to RT, because and we're just using this as a stepping stone to your own coverage of Aleppo and who you spoke to and so on. But when the camera is gone, people leave they leave people under the rubble. This is Aleppo residents speaking to RT, an RT journalist, about the white helmets and how they actually treat people who are trapped under rubble. We have mentioned this before, but it's interesting that that we're getting absolute confirmation of this from residents.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Lizzie Phelan actually was on the ground in Aleppo at the same time as I was, but visiting different areas at different times. The testimony that she put out in that article was pretty horrifying, actually. One gentleman, I think, said that the white helmets were not rescuing civilians, they were leaving them under rubble to die, a pretty damning indictment on the white helmets. And another guy mentions the fact that he took his baby girl into a so-called white helmet triage center. They injected her and they killed her in the process. So that would, at the very least, cast a shadow over their claims to be fully trained paramedics. And the majority of the testimony, in fact, no, universally the testimony that I took from civilians leaving all the various districts of East Aleppo, when asked about the white helmets, we got blank looks. So we then changed the question to, okay, was there a civil defense on the ground? Were there paramedics on the ground? Then, to some extent, they recognized what we were talking about, but then they almost immediately, unprompted, said to us, yes, of course, Nusra Front had their own civil defense, but they were there primarily to help the terrorists. They were not there to help civilians. Again, we were told there were no professional doctors on the ground, which again raises the question about, for instance, Hamza al-Khatib. We were told that the White Helmets were facilitating a lot of the terrorist actions inside East Aleppo, including, as we know, some of the executions they carried out against Aleppo civilians. So again, this completely dismantles the sort of the edifice that is the White Helmet image, based upon, of course, their own footage, their own propaganda, and the support they receive, particularly from the UK regime. Now, again, my other question would be, where were the White Helmets? They were nowhere to be seen during all of my time in East Aleppo. Of course not. They left on the bus with Nusra Front, and they are now in Idlib with Nusra Front and the various terrorist and militant factions. They didn't stay behind to help the civilians that they claim, again, to have been helping for the last 5 years.
Right. Well, let's hear from some witnesses then. And we're starting off with children from Jibrin. Just give us a little bit of background to what we're about to see.
Yeah, this was actually, I'm trying to remember the dates. This was actually just after Christmas. And we decided to go back to the Jibrin Registration Center, which was the area where all of the civilians came to in order to register prior to joining their families in West Aleppo, or going to the Jibrin refugee camps, or being transported on to areas like Latakia and Tartus on the coast. So basically, this was the center where over 95,000 civilians registered officially, having left East Aleppo. And we were told there was probably about another 10% that had not come to the registration center, but had gone directly to families in West Aleppo. So in total, around 110 excuse me, 1,000 civilians left East Aleppo for the government-held areas in Syria.
Okay, well, let's have a look at this then.
What do you want to ask her?
What was the most difficult moment for her in the...
فاطمة شو كان أصعب لحظة عشتيها حياتك؟ شو هي؟ She said it was in Aleppo. It was difficult from the armed groups, the terrorists.
Did she have anything to eat? Did she have anything
لحظة يعني شو صار؟ From the shooting,
They were shooting
مين
at
كان
her?
ضرب مين كان يضرب؟ The armed groups.
Did they have enough to eat?
كان عندكم أكل منيح تاكلوا هني؟ No.
The terrorists were keeping everything?
كانوا يعني مسلحين يخبوا الأكل إله؟ Yes.
لحتى آخر شيء قتلناهم عشان بالليل نطلع نفش الدكاكين وناخذها.
He said that eventually we had to attack the armed groups there in order to get the food, and we looted their places.
Excellent. Did they have any schooling, any education? Did they go to school at
كنتوا
all?
تروحوا على المدرسة أو شيء؟ No.
لا كنا نروح الجيمن.
They used to go to the mosque to study.
Okay. And who was teaching them?
مين كان يعلمكم؟ مين كان
هنيك في شيوخ.
شيخs.
Sheikhs. Okay. And
Religious leaders.
what were the schools being used for?
شو كانوا
Were the-
وشو المدارس لشو كانوا يستخدموها؟
عشان يبركوا فيه. عشان يبركوا فيه. عشان يبركوا فيه.
He said that the armed groups used the schools to stay in them. شو هو؟
يظلموهم شغله.
And used to imprison people in the schools.
Are their families all okay? Or were
كل
any of their
عائلتك
families
منيحة؟
injured?
Yes.
And how do you feel now with being there? They liberated from Musa al-Hayy.
شو حاسس هلا بعد ما طلعتوا من هنيك يعني؟ شو شعورك بعد ما طلعتوا من هنيك؟
احنا مبسوطين.
They're happy. مين كان في مسلحين هنيك؟ بتعرف اسماء المجموعات؟ I asked him what kind of armed groups there. Do you know the names of the groups? He said no.
But they were all armed groups.
يعني شلون اسمائهم؟
يعني اسم المجموعة مثلا مين كانوا؟
مثلا هلا اسماء العالم؟
لا ما العالم المجموعة.
مثلا في جبهة نصرة.
نصرة فرونت.
وفي أحرار الشام.
أحرار الشام.
وسلطان مراد.
سلطان مراد.
أبو عمارة.
أبو عمارة. زنكي.
زوار الشام. مخزوم.
كل هدول.
مسافرين بس في زوار الشام.
He said a lot of groups there.
Were they strangers or were they people they knew?
كانوا في غريبين منهم يعني أجانب.
يجوا منا السودان.
So Sudanese. Sudanese. شو لسه؟
يجوا سودان. ما بعرف يجوا.
شو؟ شو وين؟ السودان غيرهم
بس السودان يجي منا رقم واحد سكر ملوطة خليطة.
They were a mix, but he saw a lot of from Sudan.
كلهم يخوفوا.
He said they were scary.
يجوا لعنا ننزل ذبح الذبح حنا نبروح.
He said that when they come, we were very afraid. We used to close the door and stay inside the house.
Did Musa al-Hayy try to shut them when they escaped?
حاولوا المسلحين يقوصوا عليكم وقت كنتوا بدكم تطلعوا. Yes. And they used to attack women with knives. يلا الحمد على السلامة.
Vanessa, the comment in the chat box is that it's amazing that these children are still laughing.
This was, I mean, these kids. It's still emotional to actually watch this. These kids were extraordinary. I mean, considering what they had lived under for this length of time. Part of what we did, actually, Pierre Lecouf, who was actually with me when we talked to these children, the day before we'd gone with him dressed as Father Christmas to take presents to these children, and we were mobbed. We were absolutely mobbed by them. But actually, if you look into their eyes, you can actually see, although they're laughing and because they're kids, they're making light of the situation. A lot of damage has been done in the last 5 years to these children. And one of the themes that we heard, not only from Faraz Shahabi, but from many people, was that the only way to heal these children and to ensure that they're not infected by this extremist disease for the future is through education, through secular education. And the free education that is available to them in Syria is one of the greatest weapons that Syria is using to combat this extremism that's been injected into their country, emanating, of course, predominantly from Saudi Arabia.
Yes, okay. Well, look, we're rapidly running out of time, so let's just move on now. This article that you posted on 21st Century Wire just before Christmas, or just after Christmas, IED explosion in Saqqara district of East Aleppo. Really, the point here is that as the terrorists were leaving Eastern Aleppo, they left a lot of stuff behind. And then we've got tweets like this one from Lena Shami saying Russian forces with Assad and Iran militias defiling the pure earth of Aleppo, when in fact what they're doing, because what she's pointing out is in the photograph, she's showing an image. One of the images is of a Russian soldier writing on the walls of Aleppo, but in fact what they're doing is they're marking buildings and areas which have been cleared of mines, and what they're doing is putting their own lives at risk to clear these areas of the IEDs that Al-Qaeda have left behind.
Absolutely. And when she talks about these Russian sappers defiling the pure earth of Aleppo, no, they're detoxifying the pure earth of Aleppo from the poison that was left behind by the Nusra Front terrorists, with whom she left, by the way, on the bus to Idlib. So yes, many areas wherever we drove, you could see entire streets with the signage "No Mines," which meant that fundamentally the civilians were safe to return to their homes. When we were in Sukhari, that area had not yet been cleansed of the various booby traps and IEDs that had been left behind. And because that was the last area to be liberated, it was the most densely covered by these IEDs and mines. And in fact, that day, the explosion happened literally in the house opposite to where we were standing. 33 people were terribly injured in that blast, and at least 3 people were killed. One child, in fact, his mother and father were caught in the blast, and that was on Christmas Eve. So, you know, these Russian sappers, as you say, I think they cleared, I can't remember the figures, but thousands of hectares of booby-trapped land and buildings and residential areas in Aleppo were cleaned and cleared and made safe by these heroes. There's no other way to describe them. And also not forgetting the Russian field hospitals that were set up across East Aleppo to treat civilians that were leaving, having not received any medical treatment for over 5 years.
Okay, and we'll end with this story here, which I have to say, I had a look before the program, and I could not find any coverage of this in the British mainstream press at all. Vanessa, maybe I'm wrong, but I couldn't find any. And this story of the Damascus water supply. Now, of course, there was a ceasefire called brokered by Russia and Turkey just before Christmas, and that's mostly, as I understand it, mostly holding. But there's this issue of the water supply to Damascus. 5.5 million people in Damascus, and well, what is the situation with the water there? Early reports were suggesting it was poisoned, and then since then we're hearing that infrastructure has been damaged. Have you got to the bottom of what has actually happened here?
Well, look, the situation is just before I left Damascus, they'd poured, I think it was 500,000 liters of diesel into this essential water supply for the 5 million people of Damascus. And in fact,
sorry, you said they poured. Who poured?
Nusra Front, sorry, Nusra Front terrorists, yeah. And in reality, just before I was leaving Damascus, I was seeing that, yes, water supply was sort of trickling to a halt in Damascus. And there was a lot of panic buying of mineral water. Then I was told that the Nusra Front terrorists and various other militant factions under their control had detonated various tunnels under the water supply and under the buildings and infrastructure of the village that houses that water supply, and destroyed it. Now, Nusra Front are officially a terrorist organization and are therefore exempt from the ceasefire. So the Syrian Arab Army, of course, has been attempting to retake the area in order to secure this essential water supply for 5 million civilians in Damascus. And that includes, of course, using their air power against the terrorist occupants of the Wadi Barada village and its surroundings. Another point that I want to make is that Lina Shami, for example, is constantly citing the magic figure of 100,000 civilians in Wadi Barada. Now, if someone only needs to go to Wikipedia to see that in 2004 there were less than 4,000 civilians in Wadi Barada, and to my knowledge, the majority of those civilians have been managed to get out of the area via, yet again, humanitarian corridors set up by the Syrian Arab Army and its allies. So, let's avoid another entire Aleppo narrative where these terrorist supporters like Lina Shami are exaggerating figures. They're lying fundamentally, because Nusra Front are not under any ceasefire deal and are legitimate targets for the Syrian Arab Army, particularly when they're depriving 5 million Syrian civilians in Damascus of clean water.
Well, unfortunately, the opportunity to avoid an Aleppo-style narrative is not being taken by any of the mainstream press that are actually covering this. So here's the Washington Post. A once beautiful valley in Syria is now a microcosm of the country's war. And as you read on down through the text, it's all about how the bombs are raining down daily, deepening the misery on civilians caused by a government-imposed siege that has emptied market shelves and left residents relying on wood fires to stay warm in the winter cold, and so on. It's incredible. And who has actually written this? Well, it's this lady, Louisa Lovelock, ex-Chatham House. I don't think we need to say any more. So, you know, the propaganda continues and will continue, I'm sure. But let's just ask, I just wanted to find out a bit more about this, also from Lina Shami. Official statement by civil society organizations in Wadi Barada urging the international community to hold the responsibilities. Not quite sure what she means by that, but give us the background to this.
Well, I mean, this is a statement putting out, of course, yet again, trying to facilitate further foreign intervention to protect those mythical 100,000 civilians in Wadi Barada. But also what is interesting is that these statements were signed by the White Helmets. So yet again, we're seeing the White Helmets participating in what is effectively a war crime, chemical warfare against 5 million civilians in Damascus, supporting the Nusra Front narrative, and working alongside the militant factions in Wadi Barada. Now, let's have a quick look at the Wadi Barada situation, just very simplified version of events. Wadi Barada was under control of Nusra Front. The Syrian government was negotiating, as it is with many of these essential infrastructure areas that are held by either ISIS or Nusra Front. They were negotiating with terrorists in order to secure clean water supply for their own civilians in Damascus. Those terrorists who had been benefiting financially from the Syrian government in order to keep supplying clean water to Syrian civilians then poisoned that water. So the Syrian government is left no alternative but to militarily take that area to secure clean water for its civilians in Damascus. This is the logical explanation for this situation, Mike. What Louisa Lovelock, or whatever her name is producing for the Washington Post is some fantasy world Nusra Front prefabricated story that they have lined up depending on where they next decide to hit. And let's imagine that if this is prefabricated, which of course it is, you know, how convenient that Nusra Front decide to poison this well at this time and to provoke the Syrian government to militarily attack it, just as Aleppo has been liberated and mainstream media is about to be exposed for the criminal liars that they are. Am I being a little bit cynical on this?
I wouldn't think so. But the comment from the Syrian government, of course, is that the people that are the terrorists that are in that area at the moment are entitled to leave for Idlib, as they were from Aleppo. And we'll just end with this one again from Lina Shami about the demonstrations in Idlib city. This was just before the new year, so this is where the final gathering is taking place.
Yeah, very much so. And we know that the Syrian Arab Army now is making huge advances into the southern countryside of Aleppo, so towards Idlib in reality. So I think, you know, what is important now is not to forget the lessons that we've learned from East Aleppo. Effectively, that the civilians of both East and West Aleppo were disappeared for 5 years, and their protection was given not one single thought under any humanitarian pretext umbrella by the corporate media, by the UN, by our regimes, and by the various think tanks and NGOs that are effectively working against Syria. So we must be bearing those lessons in mind when we are going to be moved onto Idlib, let's say, and when exactly the same techniques of propaganda are going to be deployed. They're running out of ideas, they're running out of capability, and the reason that they are able, that they're not able to now propagandize Idlib in the same way as Aleppo is because of Aleppo. So it's very important that we do not allow the bloodshed of the people, both the civilians in Aleppo and the forces that have died liberating Aleppo. We must not allow that to be in vain, and we must not allow Idlib to become another Aleppo, not in the way that corporate media will portray it as being another Aleppo, in the way that we know it to be another Aleppo.
Okay, well, I think that's a good place to leave it. Thank you very much, Vanessa, for joining us today. Thank you for everybody that watched. We will be back, as usual, at 1 p.m. tomorrow with David Scott. Thanks for joining us. Bye-bye.